Hey, it is our last episode of RuPaul's Drag Race. So I really enjoyed recapping it, but not a lot of people are watching it. So if you watched any of my episodes or are just caught up now or anything and want me to continue, please just say something because I don't want to do this alone. So I did a beautiful recap of the reunion and the finale. Talked about everything and everyone, and not only did my camera die halfway through, but the memory filled up. So I lost all that, so I'm doing it for the second time. So just assume if I missed something, it was in the first recap. I'm going to first just kind of hit everyone who wasn't the top four. Nina, these are all spoilers, by the way. Nina West got Miss Congeniality, which is like 1000% deserved. The Miss Congenialities tend to go on to do really well. In general, they tend to be really likable and do really well. I think Valentina was the only exception where it wasn't so much likable as it was, well, I guess people, they liked her, so, but usually in general, they're really, really nice, and they're like a Nina West. Anyway, who did I call her Nina Flowers the first time? That would be a funny mistake, because she's not Nina Flowers. Anyway, Nina West. So there was some fighting. I'm not really interested. Raja was up in everyone's business. You know, some other people tried to kind of get in there. I'm not really interested. I'm really only interested in Nina to the end. So that's at the last six. So our top four, Brooklyn, Evie, Silky Ikaria, and then Nina and Vanjie are kind of the only ones I'm going to hit. Like I said, I already did this once, so I'm kind of exhausted. I'm kind of already wore out. My throat's ready to sore. Anyway, enough excuses, because that's what the reunion is for, excuses. So right off the bat, so there's a couple of interesting things. I would say Ikaria kind of plateaued for me. Silky went up in my estimate just a tiny, tiny bit because we saw her kind of even. So the one thing that's always kept me from being like Silky, first of all, I want to be a jerk. Secondly, is the fact that her competitors have always really liked her. And the judges liked her. The judges less so because they don't see, and there's people that they liked in the past that I was like, these are not good people. Like Fifi O'Hara and Tyra Banks. Not Tyra Banks, Tyra, the other Tyra. I can't remember her last name. Anyway, but the fact that her competitors who spent all this time in the workroom with her seem to really like her. So that always gave me pause. Now, I don't think that's an editing thing. If they had footage of her being more interesting, they would have, and interesting in a nice way or whatever. I think it was mostly, it's always hard to see because we see the whole episode. I think it has to do with her talking heads. And now, I have a lot of sympathy for this because as a creative person, which means that you are, I mean, a lot of people are creative. So this is not to mean like, oh, the special people. I think anybody who creates for a living and has to make decisions about what they're going to do, basically a self-employed creative, has this, you've probably seen the Venn diagram of like, believing you're the only person in the world who can do this, and being absolutely sure that you're the worst person in the world to do this. That overlap is where creatives live, because you kind of need to, you can get into it, read Art and Fear, you can read The War of Art, which I wasn't as big on. I love Art and Fear. There's The Artist's Way, who for me was right in the middle. Love Art and Fear though, go read it. It's the one that's got two male authors. Everyone says, well, which ones? I can only find one. But anyway, Art and Fear. But it talks about the idea that the same part of you that questions and pushes is also the part that undermines you, and you've got to kind of embrace it and just kind of deal with the up and down. And I think a lot of people that are creative tend to try to fake it until they make it, and in the meantime send out stuff out into the world that's not a good representation. Because if all we ever did as creative people was talk about how unsure we are of our work, everyone would be like, if they don't even know if it's any good, why do I? And it's, you know, it's The Gap by Ira Glass, if you've ever read that, about you have good taste, but your execution is low, and there's this gap, and you've got to overcome it, and in the meantime, you're unhappy with your work, but that's exactly why you should continue. Anyway, I think Silky is a victim of that. She's been in the pageant circuit, which, you know, benefits on fake it until you make it confidence, but it doesn't come across great in a reality show. I think she strikes out. She's got this protective barrier. Anyway, So my point is, I don't enjoy Silky as a performer, but I am open to the fact that she might be on a path of growth, and I'm going to keep an open mind to her in future seasons and future events. I think she might eventually get a little better stability underneath her, and we might be able to see the likable part of Silky that her competitors saw, and a little bit less of the negative parts that came out where she was snapping at other people, especially Evie, who I think has nailed the vulnerability part and maybe not as much the polish. So anyway, so Silky for me, not even going to really talk about. Icaria, I think, is another. This is why I don't seem to be drawn to the pageant girls. If you were to go through and I was to say who did well, but who did I like, I think you would find that I don't really like, drawn to, instinctively turn my head toward the pageant girls, because maybe that's because I'm a female, maybe it's because, I don't know. I could be wrong. The problem could be that I'm just wrong. But being a beautiful, poised woman, there's thousands of those. That's boring. Perfection's boring. That's not interesting to me. I want to be entertained. I want to see something new and different, exciting, especially funny, interesting. And I think the pageant scene doesn't necessarily reward that. It does turn out some amazing queens, but I think there's... they come to RuPaul's Drag Race, and what they're missing is a little bit of roughness, a little bit of vulnerability. And maybe that's a protective mechanism from being attacked by the world. Who knows? I don't know. Talk to me in the comments. Tell me. But in general, I don't tend to be as drawn to them as I do the queens who tend to be a little bit more vulnerable and rough and exciting point of view, which is why for me, Evie has been on a gradual upswing. You see her first look coming in the runway and it's a little rough. It is rough around the edges, but it has a strong point of view. So you're a little bit like, oh, is this just a front? Is this something that she worked on with her friends to have an interesting look? Or is this her? And what we found, like, I love the T-Rex costume. I think it's funny. I think it's interesting. I think it's different, but it's still drag. Like, it was still a drag T-Rex. And so I'm like, oh, or Velociraptor, I don't know. But I was like, oh, that's interesting. And the fact that she said, I loved dinosaurs as a kid and all that. And I was a nerdy kid. And you go, I see it. I'm so glad that you took something from your childhood that you loved and you incorporated it into a challenge. And we saw that in the way, like, comes out and does like this. It's like, who hasn't done this as a kid? Rawr, I'm a dinosaur. So for me, I'm a real fan of Evie. If you go back and I would like to say if you go back and you watch my recaps, you'll see... I think Icaria is the only one that I didn't really see coming. I liked Icaria. When we learned about him adopting his nephew, I was like, why didn't we get more of that? Why didn't we get more of the human side of Icaria? Everything we saw was like, I'm wonderful, I'm awesome, which is great. But I want to know why. Is that a fair question to ask? So for Icaria, for me, fine with the top 4. I think she got a little bit of the Kennedy Davenport, which is like, and I feel bad for that, but like I like Kennedy more when she was talking about how not as many people came to greet her. And I was like, oh, I'd go greet her. But then she'd be a little snappy and I'd be like, okay, well maybe if I went and greeted her and she was mean to me, I wouldn't be as excited either. So Icaria, I don't have a problem with. It's beautiful. When I first watched the show, very first season 1 through the Vaseline filter, I thought it was all about just looking like a woman. And I did everything through that lens of like, does it look like a woman or not? After watching for 19 billion years, it gets a little more nuanced where I'm like, okay, yeah, you can look like a woman. That's interesting. But can you, can you put on a show? So anyway, what I am getting to, and this is where it's a little contentious, and this might not be a popular opinion, but for me, Brooklyn started to plateau and actually slide down a little bit the last 2 episodes, the reunion and the finale. The finale story seemed to be, I'm beautiful and white, but there's more to me than that. And it's like, what? That's your starting point, is that you're talented. I mean, Brooklyn is definitely talented. If you watch my very first episode, I was like, this is someone I like. And that continued. But at some point, I think, and I don't want to be like, oh, well, now that they're on top, I want to knock them down. So much is like when you get to the top, if you're at the top and you're picking on everyone underneath, you are now Mean Girls. You are now the head cheerleader dating the football team captain and you're making fun of the girls underneath you and it's no longer cute. And you go, oh. And that's kind of the vibe I got from Brooklyn, was like, yes, from up here on my shiny ivory tower, I'm going to talk. And there was a couple of moments that I can really summarize. Now, I don't hate Brooklyn. I just was like, I'm not as, you know, in the beginning, kind of heading into the finale and the reunion, I was like, Brooklyn, Evie, I'll be happy with either one. Brooklyn's definitely earned it. And then after that, I was like, I really kind of don't want her to win. I wouldn't be sad. I thought there was a really good chance that she would. But it was a little bit too much like, there's a reason why stories in general have a down and then an up, is because when someone goes like this, you kind of feel like, oh yeah, I gave for them. They were already on top and they just steadily rose. You know, that's how we all want our life to be. But what we really want is like bottom to the top, or top to the bottom to the top, or if you're in literature, top to the bottom and they stay there. But I mean, this is a story plot of like, you know, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back, that kind of thing, which is, you know, rags to riches to rags, or wait, riches to rags to riches, is that from a story point of view, it's not a very compelling story to be like, so they were kind of here and then they just steadily rose, and then when they got to the top, they were crappy to everyone underneath them. Now, she wasn't crappy, but the one thing, there's a couple things. One was at the reunion when they were talking, her and Vanjie had broken up, which is fine. And some people said it's better than cheating. Okay, yeah, I guess it's better than cheating, but that's hardly a great defense. But when RuPaul asked, do you guys want to get back together? And Brooklyn said, well, I know Vanjie does, and I guess I'm open to it. I was like, and my first thought was, Vanjie, pipe up and say, well, don't be so sure about that. I'm not just sitting around waiting. You know, and I was a little bit like, oh, that's not a good look. Like, that's not a, you know, like, you must have known we were always disappointed, but to be like, oh, I know Vanjie wants to get together, and I guess maybe I'm open to it. I would have been like, hold on, let's not be so convinced that I'm ready to just race back. I got stuff going on too, and I'm sure Vanjie definitely has stuff going on. Anyways, so that was like, I was like, oh, but maybe she just misspoke. But then she turned around later on and was like, they were like, oh, so I heard that no one likes Scarlett. And Brooklyn's like, well, let me speak to that. And I was like, girl, hush. No. When you're in the Final Four, don't go slapping at girls who were out in the first couple episodes. Like, if you go back and look, I had kind of a problem with Scarlett, but Scarlett kind of the same thing as Silky, which is like, I'm gonna be my own hype man, and I didn't necessarily like it, but the way that she was kicked off the show was super tough, because it was like, she got attacked for saying that someone else who was also on the bottom should go home, Raja, and it was just like, okay, well, she didn't deserve that. That was really crappy. Secondly, for Brooklyn to be like, well, I said that everyone hated her, and I didn't like her, but I shouldn't have spoken for everyone else, was a little bit like, okay, well, when someone's already down, why are you kicking them? Like, now would be the time just to say, you know, I was really out of line. And it was really, you know, I really regret that. And you know, and maybe even say something kind. Like, Scarlett has a lot of talent. I'm sure she's going to be going places. And, you know, I look forward to working with her. Like, be generous. Like, now is, what happened to your Canadianness with like the, I'm sorry, you apologize for everything. And being really nice. Like, it wasn't really mean. And like I said, so it brought me from, so Brooklyn just kind of plateaued and went down a little bit. It wasn't like, boom, I hate Brooklyn. It was just like, ooh, that's not a great look. And that's not a great sign for the future. And I'll be interested to see in a year from now if this is like just a wobble, or if this is like, for me, in a year, Brooklyn's like, well, I was in the finale, so don't you talk to me, and all that. I was a little disappointed. So that was that. I didn't like her going for Scarlett. It just seemed mean. It just seemed like, just there's a good time to hold your tongue, and that would have just been an appropriate time just to like not volunteer. And if someone asked directly, for her to be like, yeah, I said it, and I, you know, it wasn't very kind of me. Another thing I saw Brooklyn say, it showed up on YouTube, was where there was like it was an event and she was there with Silky. I'm guessing it was, I don't know what it was, but someone asked But Silky was saying how her and Vanjie were best friends, and Brooklyn chimed up with, well, I've been inside her. And I just felt like it was such a, first of all, it's just a tacky. Now I'm a little bit of a prude, so maybe that was just me not being sex positive enough. But it was more of one of those, like, notch in my bedpost moments where it was like, well, yeah, you would be friends with her, but I did her, and so that's a much bigger deal. Especially knowing that they broke up. It was a little bit just sort of like, they call it burning, which is basking in reflected glory, which is like, clearly someone asked about Vanjie, and they were, I don't know, it just seemed like such a hurtful way to kind of use Vanjie as a, I don't know, as like a society, not, like I said, I don't know, I can't think of the words to put it in, but it just was one of those things where I was like, oh, that's such a gross way to say that you get props. I don't know, I'm not explaining it well, but it just was, a couple of the girls said they felt like Brooklyn was attaching herself to a well-known personality, and you know, I don't want to be crude, but anyway, dating above your weight class, I guess, in terms of like, here's someone more important, and they're kind of interested in me, so I'm going to use them to get attention. Now, I don't think that had nothing to do with Brooklyn's wins or anything like that. But it just was kind of, it was just, to me, didn't show a very kind heart. Anyway, so that's my thing with Brooklyn, was I was a little bit like, oh, just a little less excited. There you go, long way to say it. I mentioned Silky, Ikaria, so Evie for me was by far the most interesting. This is an example of who should go on RuPaul. This is someone who has a lot of great pieces, but hasn't really put it together into a finished product. And RuPaul helped her. I feel that Evie at the end was an extravaganza of polish and interesting point of view, and came in super interesting point of view, not fully pulled together. And we see this, a bit of a bumpy road, some missteps. We see more vulnerability. We see more interestingness. I am thrilled with Evie as a final queen. I think she's going to find a lot of great support. I'm hoping that some of her, like, kind of aggressively helping people, which is kind of how it was, which is like unasked for help. I get that. There's a certain type of personality who tends to perform on stage, who also tends to want to be acknowledged for their insight. And I think that might be Evie's thing, is she wants to be acknowledged for her insight and her awareness of, you know, I mean, she was right. It wasn't asked for. As Nina West put it, these are your competitors. You don't have to help them. Which is true, you know. So she could have just kept her mouth shut and been like, well, if I was her, I would have done this. But whatever. She got through it. She did great. Like Raja from season, like our Raja, the one who won, not the one this season, was saying how when she watched the show, she was like a little bit like, ugh, Evie's saying a little too much. But she said, I watched my old season, and there's people who could have felt that way about me. And you go, you know, yeah, that is, and it's hopefully some of it is just kind of natural maturity, and combined with confidence of like, okay, I don't have to say anything. I'm willing to say it if you ask, and I'm willing to help, but I don't have to say it. I don't have to point it out to everyone. So I'm super happy with the win. Like I said, just to clarify, I still like Brooklyn. It was just kind of a little surprising, like, oh, you know, because what you can see is, remember, this was filmed months after the show appeared, and so I think everybody's had a time, and I think a lot of it's gone to Brooklyn's head, whereas I think maybe people like Silky, maybe it evened out, like, oh, I wish I would have went into that. We'll see. We'll know better. I heard there's an All-Star season coming up. Man, I would love for them to bring back some of the season 1, 2, 3 girls. Maybe most of them can't work it into their season. And my thing for All-Stars is I would like to see an All-Stars that is just like the normal season. I don't like this, the tops are sending the bottoms home. I don't like to see the tops lip syncing because you see the same ones over and over again. I think the format would be fine. I would totally watch it being exactly the same. I don't need any tricks. I don't need any hooks. I don't need any, you know, teams. I don't need anything weird. I'd be happy just to see queens that I already like. There you go. So hit me up in the comments.